If your long-lost twin daughter suddenly showed up in front of you, but you had no idea who she was, you'd probably get into some pretty funny situations. And that's exactly what happened to Nick. One day, his daughter came home from summer camp. Nick quickly noticed something was different. She was usually wild and playful, but now she was unusually quiet. She also seemed much more mature. Nick thought it was a little strange, but he didn't think much of it. He figured a month at camp had changed her a bit. What he didn't know was that the girl standing in front of him wasn't his daughter Hallie, the girl he'd raised for 11 years. She was actually Annie, his other daughter, the one he'd never even met. At the same time, something very similar was happening in London. Annie had come home to her mother Liz, but the girl standing in front of Liz wasn't Annie at all. It was Hallie, the daughter she'd never seen. So both parents had mistaken the wrong daughter for their own. And it all started in the summer of 1998. That summer, the two girls met at summer camp. The moment they saw each other, they were shocked, because they looked almost exactly alike, but they quickly became rivals. One girl was from California. She grew up on a vineyard. She was carefree and playful. The other was from London. She grew up in a huge mansion. She was classy and well-mannered. They couldn't have been more different. But as they spent more time together, they started noticing strange similarities. They were both 11. They even had the same birthday, October 11th. They were both allergic to strawberries. They both loved playing cards. And they both loved pulling pranks. But the strangest part was, Annie had never met her father, and Hallie had never met her mother. Each girl only had one old photo of a parent, and both photos were torn in half. So they pulled out their pictures and put the two halves together. The photos fit perfectly. They had just discovered they weren't just lookalikes. They were twin sisters. Their parents were Nick and Liz. 11 years earlier, Nick and Liz met on a cruise ship. They quickly fell in love. Then they got married, and soon had twin daughters. But both of them were young and stubborn. After one huge argument, Liz took Annie back to London. She thought Nick would come after her, but he never did. Nick thought Liz just needed some space. And that's how they stayed apart for 11 years. Then the girls discovered something else. Neither parent had remarried, so they came up with a crazy plan. They would switch places. After camp ended, Annie would go to California and pretend to be Hallie. Hallie would go to London and pretend to be Annie. To pull it off, they started training each other. Hallie taught Annie how to act like a California girl, how to chew gum, how to play cards, and how to fit in at the vineyard. Annie taught Hallie how to speak proper British English, how to hold a teacup, how to act like a proper lady, and even how her family greeted each other. But there was still one problem. Annie didn't have pierced ears, and Hallie always wore earrings, so they had to fix that. Hallie put ice on Annie's ear, then used an apple behind her earlobe, and finally used a sterilized needle to pierce her ear. That was the final step. The girls were ready to switch lives. On the last day of camp, they got matching haircuts, put on matching earrings, and officially became each other. Hallie boarded a plane and headed for London. She spent the whole flight practicing her British accent. Meanwhile, Annie headed to California to finally meet her father. When Hallie landed, the family butler picked her up. She used the greeting Annie had taught her and didn't give herself away. Soon, she arrived at the London house and finally met her mother, the woman she'd only seen in pictures, Liz. Hallie ran straight into her mother's arms. Liz didn't recognize her at all. She simply thought camp had changed her hairstyle. She had no idea the girl in her arms was the daughter she'd lost 11 years ago. At the same time in California, Annie finally met her father Nick. He didn't recognize her either. Annie was much more elegant and reserved than Hallie, and Nick quickly noticed something was off, especially the way she talked. It was completely different, but Annie managed to get away with it. Back at the vineyard, the nanny didn't notice anything either, but the family dog quickly sensed something was wrong. Annie had to make up an excuse. She said she still smelled like summer camp. So far, the girls' plan was working perfectly. But then, a new problem appeared. Nick already had a new girlfriend. Her name was Meredith. She was Nick's secretary. She was young and beautiful, and knew exactly how to charm people. But the girls could tell she was mainly interested in Nick's money. And the worst part was, Nick was actually thinking about marrying her. Annie knew if Dad got married, their plan to reunite their parents would be over. Nick was still considering marrying Meredith. He even thought she would make a great mother. Annie finally couldn't take it anymore. She openly opposed the marriage, and suddenly started speaking with a perfect British accent. Nick was even more confused. He was sure something was seriously different about his daughter. So Annie finally sent Hallie a message for help. Nick also sent an urgent fax to London, but the butler intercepted it. At the same time, Hallie was trying her best to act like the real Annie. Then she spotted the fax in the butler's hand and saw the secret signal. Hallie immediately knew her sister was was in trouble. She quickly made an excuse to leave, then rushed into a phone booth and called Annie. When she heard that Dad was about to marry another woman, Hallie knew they couldn't hide the truth anymore. The next morning, Hallie finally told her mother everything. She told Liz she wasn't Annie. The real Annie was in California. The girls had met at camp, then decided to switch places. Liz finally understood. The short-haired girl in front of her was her daughter Hallie, the daughter she'd lost 11 years ago. Mother and daughter finally got to meet for real, and Liz decided to go to California herself to bring the girls back together. Hallie came up with a little lie. She told her mom Dad was already waiting for her at a hotel in San Francisco, and he was extremely nervous. Liz became even more nervous. She kept drinking along the way, trying to calm herself down, but she had no idea that hotel was the same place where Nick and Meredith were holding their engagement party. When Liz arrived, she ran into Nick by the elevator. Nick was standing there with Meredith. The two looked very close. Liz still politely greeted him. Nick did the same. But then, he started putting the pieces together. That's when Nick realized he'd been fooled by his two daughters. Annie and Hallie finally stepped forward and told their parents the whole story. They wanted their mom to stop the wedding and get back together with Dad, but Liz refused. She didn't think she had the right to interfere with Nick's life. Instead, she told the girls they had to tell their father the truth. Meanwhile, Nick was already losing his mind. He started searching the hotel for Liz. Every time he saw a woman with short hair, he ran after her, just to make sure it was her. Then finally, he saw Liz across the pool. She was standing only a few steps away. Nick stared at her, and for a moment, it felt like 11 years had disappeared. He ignored everyone around him, and walked straight toward her. Then suddenly, he missed a step, and fell right into the pool. Nick climbed out, soaking wet, looking completely ridiculous. The girls saw their parents together again, so they finally told them everything. Nick wasn't angry. Instead, he accepted what had happened, because this crazy switch was what brought his twin daughters back together. The girls then left them alone, giving their parents some time together. Nick and Liz finally sat down and talked about their breakup. Nick asked her why she had really left back then. Liz explained they had both been too young. Whenever they fought, they said things they didn't mean. That day, she left out of anger. She thought Nick would follow her, but he didn't. Nick thought Liz really wanted to leave, so neither of them turned back, and one mistake turned into 11 years apart. Now they were finally together again, but everything was different. They had two daughters, and Nick was about to marry Meredith. Liz didn't want to ruin his life, so she decided to leave, but Nick already knew what he wanted. They finally understood. Their breakup had really started with a misunderstanding. Liz left because she was angry. She thought Nick would come after her. Nick thought Liz truly wanted to be alone, so he stayed behind. Neither one of them made the first move, and they lost 11 years. But being adults made things more complicated. They still loved each other, but 11 years couldn't disappear overnight, and Nick was already planning to get married. Liz didn't want to become the woman who ruined someone else's life. Just as they were about to end the conversation, Nick took Liz home. Then he brought her into his wine cellar. The cellar was filled with bottles he'd collected over the years. One bottle was especially important. It was the wine they had drunk at their wedding. Nick had spent years searching for it, and collected every bottle he could find. He wanted Liz to know he had never forgotten their marriage. They opened the bottle together. The mood slowly changed. The two started getting closer, but just as things were getting romantic, bright headlights suddenly appeared outside. The moment was ruined. Liz immediately pulled herself together, and the two stepped apart again. The next morning, before sunrise, Liz decided to leave. She took her daughter all the way to the airport, and eventually left California. When Liz and Annie returned to London, they went back home. But Liz had no idea Nick was already on his way, and she had no idea that after 11 years apart, their story was finally about to change. Nick finally made it to London. This time, he wasn't going to let Liz walk away. When they met again, Liz was still unsure. After all, they had been apart for 11 years, and Nick was supposed to marry Meredith. She didn't know if they could really start over. But Nick had already made up his mind. When Liz left 11 years ago, he didn't go after her. This time, he wasn't making the same mistake. Liz still couldn't believe it. Nick was actually willing to leave everything behind and start over with her. She imagined all the problems they would have to deal with, living together again, raising two daughters, and rebuilding a family. None of that would be easy, but Nick didn't hesitate. He was ready to face it all and work through it with Liz. Liz finally gave in, and the two got back together. That was exactly what the girls had hoped for. Nick and Liz eventually got married again, and the girls no longer had to pretend to be each other. Annie went back to London. Hallie went back to California. But this time, neither girl had to grow up without one parent, because Mom and Dad were finally together again. In the final scene, the family took a brand new wedding photo. This time, the picture wasn't torn in half. The whole family stood together. The girls stood between their parents, and everyone was smiling. 11 years earlier, a torn photo had separated this family. 11 years later, a complete photo finally brought them back together. And that's how the story of The Parent Trap came to an end.